5:15 in the morning, which is typical Helen. That's exactly when Helen calls you. She calls me and she's like, I need you to be my chief of staff. And I need an answer now. It would have been absolutely cataclysmically disastrous for South Africa to have a radical EFF MKP government. The entire public housing program for the last 30 years has only served to reinforce the apartheid form.
What do you make of the Western Cape independence charge?
No, it's nonsense.
Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. Glad to have you on board again. If you're new around here, I'm Mpofu-Walsh, and on this channel, we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. Before we get started, I want to give a shout out to our new partner, Pace Car Rental, who are helping power SMWX and helping us get from point A to point B. We're joined today by the Mayor of Cape Town, Mr. Geordin Hill-Lewis. He's a fascinating politician on the rise. Not only is he the Mayor of Cape Town, he's also been an MP. He's been Helen Zille's Chief of Staff. And we had some interactions in our student politics days. It's really great to have you with us, Mr. Mayor. Thanks for joining us.
Please, it's great to be here. Please call me Geordin, and it's a pleasure to see you. We were just discussing before the show that we have a shared history in student politics at UCT.
Exactly. I was you were senior to me, but whenever Dasso at UCT would arrive in serious moments, you would be there, and people would say, "That's the serious guy. He works with Helen."
Well, student politics was great fun. And I'm glad to see that we both still involved in politics in our own ways.
Indeed,
it's super.
So, Geordin, how did you get involved in student politics?
I got involved in politics actually in high school already. In grade 11, I had like so many of us, I had a teacher who made a profound impact on my life. I had an English teacher who encouraged me to read about what was going on in or South African history in general, and what was going on in South Africa, and who probed and asked questions and encouraged debate. And I loved debate. It kind of came naturally. And I started reading as a teenager just everything I could get my hands on South African politics and political history. And just loved it. It was like just a kind of a brain explosion for a 16-year-old kid growing up in the early 2000s. And so got very involved. This was like early days of online with the old dial-up modem that made that long noise. And I used to wait on Friday mornings. I remember the president, Thabo Mbeki, used to drop these newsletters that he would write personally. Something that we've really lost, by the way, in South Africa is like personal newsletters. I used to love those. And you got this insight into the mind of the president of the country. And of course, some of it was really alarming. The early 2000s, many people may not remember the huge debate South Africa was having about Mbeki's policy of quiet diplomacy on Zimbabwe. Of course, HIV/AIDS denialism. And so there was just these wonderful debates, very intellectually stimulating, happening at the time, and I just got more and more obsessed. And then when I went to varsity, you and me were both at UCT. I arrived on campus and was genuinely surprised that 2005, there was no other political voice on campus other than the ANC. This is long before EFF. There was literally no one else. It was ANC in the guise of SASCO. I'm not sure if SASCO is even still here. Now they just call themselves ANC Youth League. But they were the only game in town. And I thought that was not healthy. There was clearly a lot of students that were hungry for a different voice. So I started a little organization called the DA Students Organization, DASO, and had enormous fun building it up. My first election I lost, actually. In 2005, I ran for SLC and lost. I was devastated, absolutely devastated. I still think it's one of the best lessons I learned in politics, by the way. It doesn't always go your way, and you've got to pick yourself up and improve. Work, work on what didn't work. And anyway, just built up the student branch, got very involved in student politics, to the detriment somewhat of my academics, I must admit.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah, and then took it from there. The rest is history, basically. But just got really, really passionate about South African politics.
Yeah, and I then grew up in UCT in the shadow of what you had built, because by the time I got there and was contesting for the SRC, DASO was the preeminent political movement on the campus. And even in that year, won the most seats.
That's amazing.
So you made my work very hard for me as an independent.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I'm very glad to hear that. And I then had a lot of fun, but it's almost the first introduction that I really got to like being on the campaign trail across South Africa, because we then built branches all over. I went and spent time at the vendor campus up in was it like Louis Trichardt, I think, and built a branch there, and at UKZN and at PE. So I just had an amazing experience in student politics. Really loved it.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that you read a number of books, like when you were blossoming into appreciating politics. Was there any one that stood out for you that was like, this?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think two that I regard as life-changing, and I think every South African should read, was obviously Peyton, Cry the Beloved Country. It's just a magnificent book, a really beautiful book. And for a relatively normal middle-class Capetonian boy who was 15 or 16 at the time, to get that very deep and emotional insight into what apartheid meant for real families, told in such a beautiful story, was amazing. And then I don't know if have you read Rian Malan, My Traitor's Heart?
No.
Oh wow, you should really read that. It's just an amazing book. I really recommend those two books to every South African. Alan Peyton, Cry the Beloved Country; Rian Malan, My Traitor's Heart. Rian is actually still alive. I don't think he lives in South Africa anymore, but an amazing author. And then I think Alistair Sparks, I think it was called, was it Chasing the Rainbow?
He had that series.
Yes, that rainbow series. Yes, whatever, Over the Rainbow, Chasing the Rainbow, something like that.
Yeah.
Excellent. And then also, you'll be very pleased to know that in high school I read Biko as well. That was fascinating.
Wow.
That's probably the first time that I started to toy around with what does it mean to be a political liberal. Obviously he presents his critique, but it's very clear from his critique that he has some sympathy with the basic precepts of political liberalism. So that was all just amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think it is to be a liberal, and why does that viewpoint resonate with you?
So I think at that stage, if you'd asked me what it was, I would not have been able to define it.
Sure.
But it's your first introduction to these concepts, and you read and learn a little bit about it. The way that, firstly, let me say those titles have become almost useless in modern politics, because Donald Trump rails against liberals, and his definition of what that is very, very different from what it means in the South African context or the European context or whatever.
So true.
But what is important to me is the idea of expanding personal liberty, the ability of each person to make meaningful use of the opportunities that they are given in life, and the things that hold them back, stand in the way of them making use of those opportunities, should be removed over time, and that there is a role for the state to do that, to try and remove those obstacles to accessing your freedom, so to speak.
Sure.
So that's really what it means. Central to that is good old liberal concepts of free expression, which is very, very important to me.
Yeah.
And an open debate. A proper interrogation of ideas, and actually, this is important in South Africa today, the primacy of ideas. We don't talk enough about ideas. We talk a lot about what is on the to-do list to do for South Africa today. What are the things that we have to reform and fix? And of course, all of that is important. But we also have to try to talk about the kind of society we wish to pursue and build. So I like
Yeah.
ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. The next thing in your political career was working under the wing of Helen Zille.
Yeah.
Was she Cape Town mayor already at the time, or as she was building up to that, or?
So I had met her at UCT because I had started the STASO branch, and when she was running for mayor, I called her up. Obviously, in varsity, you have these incredible vacs that no one in the working world has anymore.
Well, so some of us are lecturers at university.
Oh, so you've got them. Oh, okay. Well, to the university elite, enjoy your long vacs. No one in the real world has those vacs.
It's a secret we lecturers keep to ourselves, because everyone's like, the students get all this time, and we're like, yes, they do. It's terrible.
So in these long vacs, I said to her, can I come and volunteer on your campaign? You're running for mayor. And I did, and loved it. That was my first real active political campaign that I worked on. It was a very small campaign compared to what we do now. The DA was a much smaller organization then. And we hadn't won anywhere in the country at that. Remember, this was our first big effort to win something. And so Helen did it. She won. And then she was in the mayor's office as mayor of Cape Town, and I was still kind of helping her out in the office, by the way, that I now occupy, which is a weird,
amazing
kind of circle of history, echo of history moment.
Yeah.
So that's how I first got to know her. And then when I graduated later in 2009, she was, again, in her next campaign, running to be the Premier of the Western Cape. She was at that stage leader of the DA. She had in the interim been elected leader of the DA. And it was storming to victory in the Western Cape. Again, it's important to remember we had never won. This was our first push to win a province. We had now gone from the city to the... And so I worked on her campaign, which was great fun. And then afterwards, basically became a researcher in the DA's research office, and really enjoyed that. And then a couple of months afterwards, probably, if I remember correctly, maybe 6 months afterwards, I'll never forget, I was still living at home, just graduated, and like 5:15 in the morning, which is typical Helen. That's exactly when Helen calls you. She calls me and she's like, I need you to be my chief of staff, and I need an answer now.
Wow.
I'm like sitting in my own room. It's not, and I'm like, there's no way that I can do that. And she was like, no, you can. And so I started out as her chief of staff, very young, worked incredibly hard, but loved every minute of it. And ended up working for her for 5 years.
What did you learn from Helen?
I mean, she's just a remarkable political talent and force.
Absolutely.
She firstly, the most incredible work ethic.
Really?
Oh man.
Because we just see these figures, on TV, but I'm so fascinated by like what they're like behind the scenes.
Helen has an unmatchable. I've never met anyone that works like
Wow.
Helen. The 5:15 phone call is absolutely standard.
Yeah. How did you survive those 5 years?
Yeah, no, it was hectic. It was hectic, and that was the beginning of the Zuma presidency. So there was a lot going on in South Africa as well. So so it was a very busy time. And so work ethic, incredibly sharp. She's always the most prepared person in the room. So, whatever the topic is, she will have read more about it. She will have pre-prepared, gone through all the questions, and then huge integrity, massive integrity. Always does what she thinks is right. So I learned a huge amount, just an enormous amount about politics from her. All the lessons and practices and disciplines which stand me in very good stead today as mayor. And I try to carry through a lot of those disciplines and practices. Try to always be the best prepared. Always make sure that you're well prepared for engagements, and that you've read every document, and remember detail, and of course the other thing, because Helen was a journalist, she also writes incredibly, which I still need to work on. And she worked for Alistair Sparks as a young journalist. So lots of great lessons to learn from Helen.
Yeah, it's interesting to think how many people have come up under Helen that I know in our generation and have learned from her and are now serious politicians or government officials in their own right. So she's also got that mentorship aspect to her.
Yeah, that's right. In my case, it wasn't like a kind of active mentorship. I worked for her, but just through observation and learning and picking up the best.
And then you become an MP at the age of 24, I believe.
That's right, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so, I had worked for Helen for a good number of years. And the DA had a rule, which I think was a healthy rule, that you could not work for the party and be an elected representative. You had to be one or the other. You had to kind of choose your lane.
That would help in
exactly,
certain other quarters.
And so I had decided I wanted to run for, it must have been the 2014 national elections, the Zuma second term. But then we had this elderly MP who retired in 2012 and decided he'd had enough and he was hanging up his boots. And so there was a vacancy. And so I thought, what I'll do is I will stand for this vacancy to understand the process. The DA has this very rigorous selection process that you have to go through. And so I thought, let me just understand this process because I'm going to do it in 18 months for the 2014 election. And, I ended up winning the process and so was elected in 2012 at quite a young age.
Yeah, and what was going into Parliament like for you at that age, and what did you learn about the country having been an MP at such an early stage, but also a formative stage for South Africa? Because that term, and I would say 2012, marked something of a turning point in our politics, where as Zuma had been ascendant before that, the cracks started to emerge in the Zuma administration.
Yeah, good memory. That's exactly right. So going to Parliament, you start off as something called a backbencher, and you are quite literally put right at the back in the benches where no one can see or hear you, and you basically talk about once a month if you're lucky. So at first it's a terrible shock for someone who's come from student politics, who's active debater, who's very opinionated, who's very loud, and then you're basically told, oh, you can say something in 3 weeks' time on Thursday,
You had all these visions of the cameras being on you and delivering these orations.
So you start out as a backbencher, you get stuck into the committee work, and that's where it gets really fun. You get allocated to a committee. Sure. I had come from a trade and economics background, so I was put straight onto the DTI committee. And that's really where the work of Parliament happens. You start to build relations with ANC colleagues. And actually there's a lot more cooperation than South Africans see that happens in the committees. And you get some good work done. And you travel around the country doing oversight. You're stuck in there's not a great deal of glamour, I assure you. You go in a combi for like 5 days with a whole lot of ANC MPs. At the time, you're the only DA MP, and you go and look at government facilities, or you go and look at whatever it is that you're doing oversight on around the country. Those are great formative experiences and learning experiences, and that's how you start. And then over time, you slowly but surely work your way up in seniority, in ability to propose motions, to ask questions to the president even, and then you start to physically move forward and become a front bencher, and eventually join the shadow cabinet, and so that's the kind of archaic institutions of Parliament.
Yeah. Fast forward a bit, because obviously you're Mayor of Cape Town now. You spend about a decade or just under a decade in Parliament. Rise through the ranks, and then I was saying just before it feels like you were recently elected mayor, but it's actually been a long time now. I think it was end of 2021.
It's been 3 full years. It's amazing how quickly it's gone.
Yeah. What would you say is the hardest thing about being mayor of Cape Town?
I mean, overall, being mayor of Cape Town is an incredible privilege. I love it. It's incredibly enjoyable. I think maybe people have this perception that everything in Cape Town is incredibly smooth and problem-free. That is definitely not the case. There's endless issues that land up on the mayor's desk, and it's very easy to become distracted in executive office by dealing with the day-to-day crisis management, problem solving, putting out fires. And I think probably the trickiest thing is trying to remain focused on what it is that you really want to achieve, and to make sure that you carve out the time and be disciplined in your day. Really, like in quite a literal way, physically and from a time management perspective, discipline yourself to. You've got to handle the absolute tsunami of incoming issues, but you also have to make time to make sure you're achieving what you really set out and promised the electorate and stood, the basis on which you stood for the office.
Yeah. And what is it that you are trying to carve or are carving out time to do in that agenda that is most special to you?
So what worried me most and what motivated me to stand is that I think South Africans were becoming inured to the idea that government could only ever fail, and that standards were just permanently slipping in South Africa. And it really upset me as a South African to see that happening. And so I really wanted there to be a place that could try to demonstrate that it is possible to slowly but surely and deliberately improve people's lives, move people out of poverty, give them better living conditions over time, of course, and that you could actually have a place that sets high standards in the public sector. Not to say that everything is far from it, that we get everything right, but that we are unashamedly setting high standards. And there's just far too little of that in the public sector in South Africa. And so, I had this idea that Cape Town could be this place that really does inspire hope in people, that government can be a force for good in South Africa. It can't only be a constant disaster and a constant failure, and that people can, no matter where they live, frankly, even if they live here in Gauteng, they can see, well, I don't have to give up hope on the idea that South Africa can work, that we can build this country that we all want, because look, there's at least one place that's doing it, overcoming all of the massive challenges that we have bit by bit, making real improvements, making the investments necessary, fixing stuff. So that's kind of the vision that I had, and just set about doing that in a methodical way, working through all the issues that we faced. Number one of which was we had this very fast-growing city, really bursting at the seams, like all cities in South Africa. Cape Town's not unique. South Africa has very rapid urbanization, and so that the pressure on city governments is just immense to keep up with that. And you really see it everywhere around the country, the pressure on basic infrastructure, because of the number of people using that infrastructure without there being enough investment in new. So it was very clear to me that the first thing that we had to do was significantly increase investment. And actually, if we are honest about all of the problems in South African cities, it really comes down to that. Cities are not investing even a fraction of what they should be, and particularly, sadly, this city, in where we are seated now in Johannesburg.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have smashed all South African records for city infrastructure investment, more than all of the Gauteng 3 metros combined each year. And we're going to do that every year of this term. And that's going to set Cape Town up for much, much more success even, because it can begin to cope with the pressure of urbanization. And begin to see people, even if you're living in incredibly dense contexts in informal settlements, even if you've just recently come to the city, there's a genuine prospect of dignified basic services, and the spin-off of that, of course, is a growing economy. When you have a city that works, it attracts investment, it attracts jobs. And so you have the prospect not only of a better quality of life and dignified basic services, but the prospect of finding a job and getting out of poverty.
Yeah, I think one has to be fair, and what you've done and what the DA has done with Cape Town is impressive.
Thank you.
One has to admit that. And as a resident of Joburg who's lived a lot of my life in Cape Town at UCT, and I go there often, you lament, because you just think what is possible with decent, effective, and methodical governance. I mean, the situation in Joburg is just it's dire. It's dire, and I think I, as a resident, kind of have that feeling like maybe it's just impossible.
So I suppose as South Africans, we are all occasionally tempted to feel that about our country, but we have to resist that. I firmly believe it is fixable. It is going to take longer and longer. The longer you wait to start, the longer it takes.
Yeah.
So there's probably now a generational fix for Johannesburg, not just a quick couple of years. But it must be done, man. We cannot ever accept failure as the norm. That is a very dangerous place for our country to be when we start to accept failure as the norm. It has to be done. And this is such a magnificent city. Just driving around here this couple of days for this visit, it's just beautiful. It is still, I think, the most important city in Africa, and has been for the last 150 years. I was just driving in here this morning, and just opposite where your studio is that nature reserve called the Wilds. And you look up onto the hill and you see those old landlord mansions up on the hill there, and all the history that comes with those. You just get a sense of, wow, this is for like a century and a half. This has been the center of the African economy. We cannot allow it to fail. We just cannot. So it does alarm me that there's not more national focus on what's happening here. Yesterday, I attended this Goldman Sachs conference where the president was speaking yesterday morning.
Sure.
And the area around the conference looked absolutely shocking. And I just thought, for the president to come here with global financiers from around the world, surely there has to be some national focus on what's happening and how we turn this around. So I think we should not accept failure. We must fix it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the interesting things that it seems to me you're grappling with in Cape Town now is the consequences of that success. So, as you say, a lot of people wanting to move there, which means that congestion is up.
Yes.
And because it's now a destination where people want to go, you're dealing with the consequences of that. It's becoming an international destination, so that means that people come with dollars and with euros, and there's this cry that things are getting very expensive in Cape Town. How do you respond to those concerns and complaints about how, as Cape Town becomes more attractive, in some ways it also maybe becomes more unattainable for the ordinary residents?
So I always say the problems of success are better than the problems of failure.
Sure,
both of those conditions bring their own issues, but I would much rather deal with the problems of success.
Sure.
When something is highly desired and in strong demand, the price of that thing rises, and so there is affordability concerns about property in Cape Town. The way to address that is not to take the approach that has been taken in many other cities in the world, almost universally without any success. In fact, often with the perverse outcome of actually making land and property even more scarce. So you do not try to manipulate the demand side of the market. You have to stimulate the supply side of the market. And that is what we are trying to do in Cape Town. We currently are out for public comment on the most significant planning reform in the city in a long time, in more than a decade. And it will significantly ease supply and stimulate supply over the coming years, and hopefully make it much easier to obtain affordable accommodation in the city. That's in the private sector. Obviously, from the state side, we're also doing a lot of things to release city-owned land, the parcels of land that we own for affordable housing and social housing. We've released more in the last 2 years than in the 10 years prior to that combined. So we are accelerating our own city land release. We're still pressurizing other spheres of government to release the land that they own. So we really are doing a lot to stimulate the supply side, and I think that you will see that have an impact on the market in the years ahead. And then, of course, as we spoke about earlier, you have to support this all with enormous infrastructure investment, which we are doing as well.
Sure.
So we are trying to install all of those foundational building blocks of a successful city. But at the same time, I have to be honest. I live about 45 minutes outside of the city center in the suburbs, because I want to have a little bit more space, a bit more value for money. I can't afford to live in the city. Sure. So there is always going to be areas of the city that are extremely desirable, and that's a good thing. And I want them to be desirable, and they will be expensive. And part of the reason why that's great is we take the money. We have a very redistributive tax system. We take the money raised from those areas and we spend it on poor areas, on delivering basic services. So we run the most redistributive tax system in the country, and we're like unapologetic about that. So I have this standing joke with the president. I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but sorry. He is a resident of Cape Town, as you know, in a very fancy neighborhood.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And he always complains. Whenever he says to me, he has this joke that his rates and taxes are too high. and I always remind him he should be paying more, because we use that to cross-subsidize services to the to the poorer residents. So that's we also need that success, because the city needs that income. And unfortunately, what compounds the crisis in Johannesburg and other cities, it is deeply compounded by the fact that you have this enormous services and infrastructure need, but you also have declining income. Now, to fix that problem, to get yourself out of that hole, you need more money. That's the starting point.
Sure.
So it makes the problem much worse when that's the case.
I just realized you have the ultimate ace up your sleeve with these GNU negotiations. You can just switch the president's lights off.
I've considered some strong arm tactics. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's interesting to hear. And for me, the question in my mind, which is a national question, but it's also a city question, is I think Cape Town has shown how you can get the basics of governance right and how much that can benefit the entire population of the city. But of course, we're left with this deep structural legacy of inequality. I think it's unfair to say that you haven't done anything about that. I dismiss that critique. But I'm interested in your perspective in terms of how we then, if we were to stabilize our cities, we would still have these very unequal cities. How do we take that next step of moving beyond the apartheid style of our cities in a practical way? Because I think that's probably the question that confronts all future governors of South African cities. Yeah, that's so true. Look, before I get to the actual architecture of the city, I just want to say the absolutely essential prerequisite is a healthy, growing economy, which we do not have in South Africa. Sure.
And that is why there's, I hope, a new and ever-growing sense of urgency inside the GNU about the fact that for 15 years, South Africa's per capita GDP has remained the same.
Yeah.
In fact, it's slightly down. Now, that should alarm us greatly. Every South African on a per capita basis, on an average basis, is poorer than they were a decade ago. That is unacceptable. So you cannot just dump the responsibility onto city governments and say, now you've got to fix poverty and inequality.
Yeah.
When you have this failing economy. You have to have an economy that is lifting people out of poverty through growth. So for me, that is the most urgent prerequisite. Now, let's say we have, hopefully, we wish the GNU every success. In the coming years, we will have economic growth, this elusive concept, economic growth again in our country. Let's hope that happens. When it does, you will still have that apartheid architecture of the city.
Sure.
You can break that down really in two ways. You can move people closer to work opportunities, because essentially the apartheid structure is people on the distant outskirts of the city, far away from jobs, and in these kind of dormitory townships. And they have to spend 30 to 40% of their monthly income getting to work and back. Yeah. And that's often what keeps people in poverty, actually, is that no one else spends that proportion of their income. So you don't even necessarily have to have a rise in income, but if people didn't have to spend 40% on transport. So you have to get people closer to economic opportunities.
Sure.
And that we do through state land release. That is well located in and around the CBDs. And now Cape Town has 4 major CBDs, and so our land release program is targeted in and around those 4 major CBDs. Obviously, you are not going to move everyone. There's not that land availability. So public transport, a functioning public transport system, is absolutely essential. And again, South Africa simply does not have that. We have a very expensive and extremely badly regulated minibus taxi industry, which is extractive, and the rail system is by and large defunct. It is slowly but surely coming back to life, but very slowly. It is still on kind of 1/20th, I think, if I remember correctly, like 1/20th of the passenger numbers that it had pre-COVID. So it's got a long way to go. And then the cities, post 2010 World Cup, the cities got this huge injection of money to build these rapid bus transit systems. Only one of them really still runs, and that is in Cape Town, the My City system. And we are busy expanding that. The largest project in the city right now is to expand that. But to be honest, it will never replace the capacity of a rail system. The lesson of every major metro in the world, and I have no doubt you're well traveled. Just think of every major city you've been to in the world.
Yeah.
Which one doesn't have a massive functioning metro? And so that has to exist in South Africa's cities, and it currently does not. So I spend a lot of time advocating and fighting about this, because I really believe to break down the apartheid form of South Africa's cities, you have to invest in a functioning proper public transport system, and we don't have one. I'll say one more thing. The entire public housing program for the last 30 years has only served to reinforce the apartheid form.
Wow.
It has been it is certainly not a tragedy that 2.5 million people have got houses. But in a sense, there is something tragic about the fact that where those houses have been located only reinforces the spatial form. And there's a really simple reason for that. You get a grant from the national government. They say you have got to deliver houses for this, and you have to deliver a kind of numerical target. And the best way to do that is to find an enormous piece of land and do a big project, a mega project. And you're familiar with all the mega projects around Gauteng. And of course, where do you find big open pieces of land? You don't find them inside the city. You don't find them in well-located parts close to CBDs or industrial areas. You find them on the distant outskirts. And so that's where huge housing projects happen. But all that does is take people from a distant, dislocated township and move them to a distant, dislocated housing development. It does not address the spatial form. So we have to flip that whole model on its head. And that means, because it's much more expensive to build higher density inside the city, we have to be comfortable with possibly having lower numerical targets at higher per unit cost, but closer into the city. And so we have to have an honest conversation about the government's housing program. It currently does not work. Sorry for the long answer, but I think these are important issues that occupy a lot of my thinking.
No, it's a very important and maybe the question that needs to be answered as the old generation moves away and a new generation of politicians and governors come in. Speaking of which, I mean, you've spoken a lot about being a mayor and how you have to interact with national and provincial, and I just think this three-tiered system doesn't work, but I'm not even going to go there. The GNU is now in place, and it means that the DA has a stronger voice in national government. I was very interested because I noticed you were one of the early voices who at least left the door open to this potential of working with the ANC and other parties. How do you think the GNU is going so far? And do you think this gamble of allying yourselves with the ANC, who you've criticized for a long time,
of course,
has nonetheless paid off to the extent that you have greater influence and greater control over national questions?
So the most important question in politics, I think it's Bill Clinton's famous question, is always compared to what? So we are no fans of the ANC. The ANC has taken South Africa right to the brink over the last 15 years. Its performance has been shameful. But compared to what? That is the question. So you do not have the nicety in a democracy where you have this huge splintering of parties and proliferation of parties to get the outcome that you desire, your utopian perfect outcome. You get the outcome that you get, and then you try to make a government work from that outcome that avoids the much worse potential outcome. So I firmly believe that it would have been absolutely cataclysmically disastrous for South Africa to have a radical EFF MKP government. And so it was a no-brainer that we had to make an alternative work. So yes, I am very pleased that the GNU happened. I think it is the best chance South Africa's had in a decade or more, probably 2 decades, to actually turn around the trajectory of our country from what I said earlier, just steadily declining per capita GDP, to where people are actually getting, better and better and better off, and a better standard of living. So yes, I am optimistic. I believe it really has to work, and we have to do everything that we can to make it work. At the same time, of course, it cannot work at any cost. So if there's no understanding from the partners that this is a coalition, and a coalition by definition requires compromise, then it will not work. That will be very sad for South Africa. So I hope that there is an understanding. And obviously, particularly from the ANC, for whom it is obviously most emotionally difficult. I get that. From a human perspective, you've been in government for 30 years. You've never had anyone else to share power with. You may have to occasionally consult COSATU or something, but not really. And you govern alone, and now you all of a sudden your whole world is very different. Yeah. So that's like emotionally traumatic. So I get that.
Sure.
But there needs to be a radical adjustment phase, and I think what happened last week in the budget. We're talking now just a week after the infamous budget, no budget.
Yeah.
And I think that was a massive and important and positive learning curve for the GNU and for the ANC. So yes, I'm a big supporter of it. I was an early, very big supporter of it, and will remain so. I think it's the best chance our country's had in a long while.
And is it your understanding that that budget postponement was at least in part due to the DA saying this far and no further on certain proposals.
Definitely, undoubtedly. I mean, from what I understand, my colleagues maintain the confidentiality of cabinet, so I don't know exactly what happened. But from what I understand, the VAT proposal was dropped on them extremely late, and they made it absolutely clear that there's no way. VAT is a regressive tax. It impacts the poorest residents the most. It is not necessary. We had a mini budget in October which did not require any tax increases. So all of this additional spending, we just can't afford. We have to rein it in.
So the ANC, shall we say, has not distinguished itself when it comes to clean government and matters of corruption. There have been some concerns within Cape Town and the Western Cape with DA members. And can you reassure us that that's being treated with the full seriousness it deserves? We've had the Malusi Booi situation last year, and then we had JP Smith and is it Xanthea Linberg? Now, where are we with that? And can you reassure us that if any wrongdoing has been perpetrated, it will be treated with the swiftness that is demanded of ANC politicians?
I can offer that absolute ironclad guarantee. I cannot guarantee that no one is up to no good. That I cannot guarantee because I don't control those people.
Sure.
Humans are humans. They'll do what they do. But I can tell you that we operate an environment, a cultural, a strong organizational culture that if there is serious evidence against you, it is career ending. There's no two ways about it. We want every person in this country to be assured that the money that they pay as a taxpayer or as a ratepayer in a city is properly spent and spent with integrity and spent to the best use for other members of the public, for the community at large. And any abuse of that is unacceptable. Any betrayal of that trust is unacceptable. So when it is found, it is dealt with swiftly. At the same time, you also have this difficult situation where when mere allegations are made without any substantive evidence, you cannot allow that to end someone's career, because then the easiest thing in the world to do would be to remove all of your opponents just by making mere allegations.
Yeah, and false ones even.
Yeah. So you do require some standard of evidence, and of course you cannot put yourself in the position of the prosecutor or the judge, but you have a decision to make. You are the executive authority, and so. In the case of Malusi Booi, I saw very credible evidence which was shown to me by the SAPS, and I took immediate and swift action. And I will always do that when that basic evidentiary bar is met, because I really do want. I mean, the deep lack of trust for government and the state in South Africa is something that we have to fix over time. And we are only going to fix it by reasserting integrity. That's not to say that nothing will ever happen, but that when it does, it's dealt with properly.
Two more questions for you. The first is, what do you make of the Western Cape independence charge?
No, it's nonsense. I understand, perhaps the only understanding I have for it is, if I go back to the earlier question, if I put myself in the shoes of an ANC leader right now, I understand the emotional trauma of the GNU. If I try and put myself in the shoes of a Western Cape independencer, I understand the emotional impulse that says everything I look at in South Africa is going wrong. Why don't we just have our own? Here's this place that seems to be generally working. Why don't we just have our own country? But so while I understand that emotion, I do not think that is even remotely a solution. We are passionate South Africans. We want our country to work. We believe it can work. We believe we have now a chance to start making it work. And the answer is not just to cut off a little portion of it. The answer is to get stuck in and say we're not going to accept failure. We're not going to accept decline. We're going to do something about it. We're going to win. Firstly, you have to convince the public to support you. We're going to win in growing numbers. We're going to win in more places, and we're going to turn things around. So no, not my vibe.
That's a wonderfully categorical answer. So one of the things we ask our guests at the end of interviews is if there was one thing that you think we need to do differently in South Africa, what would that be?
Sure, that's a tough question. I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning. We must set higher standards for ourselves. We must never become used to the idea that things slide backwards and that backward slide is irreversible. And when that becomes the norm, when we become satisfied with that, then we are on a very dangerous path. And so we must not accept that. We have to actively push back against that and say we expect higher things of our governments from every level. And we expect more integrity. We expect more professionalism, more preparation, more excellence. The basic things on which successful societies are built, we will not settle for less. I think we have to have that kind of national attitude. I hope that we build that over time.
Geordin, thank you so much for joining us, and all the best for the future.
Thank you so much. It's been a great chat.
Thank you for joining us. Like, share, subscribe, comment down below, and don't forget to help us get to that next 250,000 subscriber milestone. Thanks for watching SMWX again. Aye.